All right, first I want to say thanks to Flo for taking my class last week while Kelly and I took a week of vacation. She had a week off between the end of her regular school year and the start of summer school, so we took off and did some camping. And appreciate the ability to be away and appreciate Flo for taking that class. And Flo's choice of topics, since he knew what I was teaching, was perfect because it talked about the Apostle Paul ahead of us starting the Book of Galatians. So if you want to open your book to the Book of Galatians, that's where we'll get started this morning and spend the next few weeks studying that particular book. The title slide there shows you a map of the area of Galatia. The book is titled To the Churches of Galatia, Tai Ekklesias Tes Galatias. That's how it looks in the Greek Bible. And I just put that in there because I needed something to fill up that space, because Greek doesn't mean too much to us, if anything, and you can go to heaven without knowing anything about the Greek. But anyway, that's going to be our title slide for this particular study as we go through and look at the book of Galatians itself. So today will be introductory material, history, all things sort of that nature. Probably won't get into the text itself, but we'll at least get a good start at the background, because Galatians is one of those books that is kind of best understood when you understand what was going on behind the scenes, if you will. We can gather that from any of Paul's books. What he writes indicates to us what's going on in that particular church or group of churches. And so we can kind of detective work our way into what was happening there. And the same is true of Galatia, but a little bit of the history of the area might be helpful to us. Just kind of a general history as you would learn in school. The area of Galatia was settled in about 278 BC by about 20,000 Celtic warriors and their families. Their people had come in to invade Greece, and they decided that they wanted to stay there. And so they broke off about 20,000 warriors and their families, settled in what would become the area of Galatia. And they were warriors. And for the next many years, until it became a Roman province in 25 BC, they were basically guns for hire. They lived a pastoral agricultural life, but their men would go and work for the highest bidder, and they were always causing trouble. And it was one of the things that the Caesar did in 25 BC, said you're going to have to quit that if you want to be a Roman province. And so they agreed to that and settled in and became less warrior-like and more farmers and shepherds and herders at that point in time. But it had been a Roman province since 25 BC, so that's quite a while for it to be a province before the time of Paul and the things and the events of the New Testament. The people in the north portion lived a rural and pastoral life, quite a contrast to the southern part of Galatia, where there was a thriving commercial center. One of the main Roman roads went right through Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra. And as a result of that, there was trade, there was commerce that went through there. The armies marched through there. So they had a thriving commercial center there in that particular area. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, because the north-south portion of Galatia is kind of a debate among biblical scholars about which group was written to in the book of Galatia. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Who wrote the book of Galatians? Paul, okay. There is hardly anyone except the most fringe scholars who would argue that. Historically, the records that support that from extra-biblical literature support that. And so it's, without a doubt, the Apostle Paul was the author of the book itself. And he starts by saying, oddly enough, Paul, an apostle. He identifies himself to those people that he's writing to. And so this is one of his many letters that he wrote. Paul was prolific, and most of our New Testament is composed of his writings and the things he had to say to the churches, which we get our information about how the church ought to operate, how the church ought to look, how the church ought to sound, the things the church should be avoiding, the things the church should be doing, all come from the Apostle Paul. And we're thankful for that, and thankful for the time he spent in writing those letters, obviously inspired by the Holy Spirit, so that we would have that record, so we would know how to operate some 2,000 years later. Here's what Paul said about himself. He said, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy that." That's chapter 1 and verse 13. Now, why would Paul point that out. I mean, let's face it. If you have some dark chapter in your life, are you going to put that in a letter to the entire region of Galatia and say, just so you know, that was me? Why did he include that? Why did Paul feel it necessary to explain or to remind the people of that particular part of his life, do you think? John?
I'm not that Paul or Saul. I'm this changed individual.
Okay, I'm not that person anymore. I have changed. How have I changed? By the gospel of Jesus Christ. Glenn?
He's going to be talking about those that are from Judaism, and he had to let them know why he wasn't what he used to be.
Sure. The issue in in the Galatian churches seems to be the Judaizing teachers, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And those Judaizing teachers were trying to bind on the Gentile Christians tenets of the law. You have to do this. You have to adopt these tenets of the law in order to be a Christian, in order to be saved. And Paul is writing to say, no, that's not the way it works. And who better than somebody who came out of Judaism to explain that to his own countrymen and all of that? Janelle and then Elwin.
You just said what I was going
Okay.
He's going to be teaching, and he's wanting them to follow his teaching, and he as an example himself, because he did come out of Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely. He came out of Judaism, and he wants them to understand that and why he came out of Judaism and why that should apply to them who are, again, trying to keep Judaism as their major part of life. Elwin?
Yes, it was also discussed a little bit later, the fact that most people knew who Saul was.
Mm-hmm.
And even when he met later in Jerusalem with Peter and James, they talked about that. And they said, well, you're going to be taking care of the Gentiles, and Peter's going to be taking care of the Jews. So Paul wanted to go into an area where nobody knew him. And so this was mentioned later as a fact that people that already knew him and that were brought up in that church and assigned elders said, that's the same man.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Paul's going to have to defend himself in the book of Galatians. We'll read about that. He's defending his apostleship in the book of Galatians. And that's for two reasons. Number one, because he had been Saul. And how can you call yourself an apostle now? But at the same time, as he's defending himself, he's saying, here's how I got to where I am. And he's going to say in a little bit, the gospel didn't come to me by men or by any man. It came to me through Jesus Christ. And so he's going to have to set the stage for who he is, what he had been, what he is now, and that dramatic change that came over his life. He said that I might preach him, Jesus, among the Gentiles, chapter 1 and verse 16. And we're not going to read these other verses, but Acts 9, beginning in verse 10, Acts 13:42, Acts 18:5 through 7 talks about Paul's, or the mission to the Gentiles, and specifically Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Because Paul, if you recall at his conversion, when Ananias said, very same question, don't you know who that is? And Jesus said, of course I do. He's my chosen one to go where? To the Gentiles. He's going to be the one to go to the Gentiles. And so that was his mission in life. That doesn't mean that Paul gave up on his Jewish brethren, because he would say, if I could give my life so that Israel could be saved, I would do that in a heartbeat. But I can't do that. And his practice was he would go into any city. Let's say he goes into Derbe or Lystra or Iconium or Antioch. And what was the first thing he did?
Go to the synagogue.
Went to the synagogue and preached and taught to the Jews. So Paul, yes, his mission was to the Gentiles, but he never gave up on his own people, and he went to preach to them whenever he had the opportunity. And naturally, the Jews and the Gentiles would be in conflict with each other with this new Christianity popping up. And so Paul would be dealing with both sides of that, and perfectly suited to that in his mission. And so those are some things he says about himself in the book itself. You know, I tried to destroy it, but now I'm going to preach Jesus to the Gentiles. And again, that change, that transformation that took place in his life. Character of the letter. And this is just what some other people have said about the book itself. The letter of Galatians may be called a statement of Paul's gospel. It has been called the Magna Carta of Christian faith, or the Charter of Christian freedom. And that's going to be a key element through this, is the idea of freedom. Freedom from what? The law. Judaism. Judaizers. And yes, free from sin, that's kind of secondary, but the main thing he's talking about when he's talking about freedom is the idea of freedom from that law. We're not bound by that anymore. It was, as it says in the New Testament, nailed to the cross, and we don't live under that anymore. And so it's a statement of Paul's gospel, and it talks about Christian liberty and how we ought to be thankful that we don't have to live under that old law, because it was tedious and it was hard, and we might almost say impossible, because Israel could never do that. And again, that's Robert L. Johnson in the letter of Galatians out of the Living Word Commentary. This is from Charles Erdman. Never does Paul argue with more clearness, more incisiveness, more convincing power. Nowhere does he reveal more indignation, more scorn, more affection, more devotion to Christ, more determination to accomplish a task. His style is unmistakable. Its vigor, its irony, its pathos, its abruptness, its vehemence, its spiritual revelation reveal Paul at the very height of his power. Just change the batteries in that, but let me... see if this one works better. All right, so Mr. Erdman is looking at that, and he says, Paul bores in on this one. This is not just a light, fluffy letter that he wrote to people, but this is a letter of passion, a letter of power, a letter of emotion. And he doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't soft pedal anything in this book. He says it like it is, means what he says, and says what he means. And it's a powerful letter when you think about the content of what it is that he has to say. William Barclay. Someone has likened the letter to the Galatians to a sword flashing in a great swordsman's hand. Both Paul and his gospel were under attack. If that attack had succeeded, Christianity might have become just another Jewish sect, might have become a thing dependent upon circumcision and on keeping the law instead of being a thing of grace. It is strange to think that if Paul's opponents had had their way, the gospel might have been kept for Jews and we might never have had the chance to know the love of Christ. Until I read that, I hadn't really given that much thought. But what if Christianity had backpedaled into a sect of the Jews? Then it would have been a Jewish sect. And how were Jews at evangelizing? They wanted no part of that. We'll accept proselytes who come in. We'll allow them to be a part of us. But they, in their own self-grandized status, thought we're God's people and there's nobody like us, and we don't want you to be a part of that. We don't consider you a part of that. And so had the Judaizing teachers have been allowed to convert the church back into some form of Judaism, they might have destroyed the Gentiles' chance to even have the gospel. And I appreciate the way that he points that out in his commentary. Audience of the book. Well, the churches of Galatia. That's what we have as in chapter 1 and verse 2 is who he's writing to. The area of Galatians mentioned 5 other times in the New Testament, and this is more of a history lesson than having any practical benefit to our lesson today. But Acts 16 and verse 6, now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. And so again, it's just mentioned as a waypoint in Paul's journeys and the events that are going on there. Not much more practical information other than that. Acts 18:23, after he spent some time there, he departed, went over to the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order to strengthen all the disciples. And so again, back there, just mentioning it as a geographic point. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 1, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must also do. And so Paul here is indicating that the things he's writing are written not just to the churches of Galatia, but to everybody. Not to the church of Corinth, but the churches of Galatia receives the same instruction. It wasn't like you had geographical churches where, well, this group of churches did this, and this group of churches did that, and this group of churches did that. Paul had a unified message for all churches, and it wasn't dependent upon the geography of that. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, and Titus for Dalmatia. And again, these are just the other mentions of the area of Galatia. 1 Peter 1 and verse 2. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Who was Peter writing to? Jews. To the pilgrims of the dispersion. That gives us the key to indicate that this was the diaspora, as it's called in scholarly literature, the Jews who lived outside of the land of Palestine, who for whatever reason had moved or been moved or pulled out of their place. And he's writing to them, and he includes those in Galatia as being part of that, which tells us about the Jewish population there in the city of Galatia. We mentioned the debate about North Galatian theory versus South Galatian theory. And Grady and I have talked about this 2 or 3 times. We discussed back and forth things about our lessons and questions and all that. What do you think about this? And this theory, in just a practical application, means absolute nothing at all. Okay? So don't get worried about it. This has nothing to do with biblical integrity or anything. But these are people like me and Grady who like to dig into the deep stuff of the history and the dates and all that stuff, which most people don't care about, and think about this. And even many scholars, they spend their lives studying this idea. Was the letter to the churches of Galatia written to the North Galatians or to the Southern Galatians? Again, Antioch, Pisidia, Lystra, and Derbe. And again, the answer to that question is immaterial to understanding the book. But let's think about it for just a second. The Roman province of Galatia embraced a very large section of Asia Minor, including in its northern latitudes a relatively small subsection called Galatia. And so the actual province of Galatia, as established in AD 25, was pretty small, and it was more up where the word Galatia is than down in Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra. But how it was looked at in that particular day, the whole area was called Galatia, around just the small actual territorial province of Galatia. And so there, again, the debate is to which group was it written to? Was it written to that small group of churches, wherever they were in the small area of Galatia, or was it the more general area of Galatia? We say southern Colorado. What does that include? Kind of whatever we want it to include. Mainly on our news stations, it's whatever towns they happen to be broadcast in. That's what they include in southern Colorado. So there's a sense, we'll put this up, Galatian, the term is used in 2 senses, one official and one popular. The Galatians proper originally belonged to the migratory Celtic tribes that we talked about at the very first. But the whole area was considered Galatia when it came to just the general idea of where this particular place was. Well, how do we determine what we think about this? Well, kind of hard, and if you want to read all that scholarly writing, you just knock yourself out. Do that just before you go to bed, and you go to sleep pretty quick. But we think about Paul's visit to the area. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, Acts chapter 13 and verse 14. So we know Paul was in Antioch in Acts chapter 13 and verse 14. But they shook the dust from their feet against them and came to Iconium, Acts 13 and verse 51. So we've got him in Antioch of Pisidia, we've got him in Iconium. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. After he spent some time there, he departed and went over all the regions of Galatia and Phrygia in order to strengthen all the disciples. So, here's kind of where I fall out on this. We know he was in southern Galatia. We know he was in those particular churches. We know there were churches there. We know they were established. and we know that he visited with them. We have no record of him being in northern Galatia. Not to say he wasn't. He could have been, and likely was, but we don't have any record in the biblical narrative of him establishing any churches in that area. And so, just because of that, I think who he's writing to are those churches of Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra in the southern part of Galatia. And so if I was somebody put a gun to my head and said, which one of those would you take? I'll take the southern Galatian theory just because of that particular reason. And again, what difference does that make? Not much of anything. Mike?
Why is that even a question? It says he went all over the region of Galatia. That would include both the north and south. So why is there a question about it when this answers it?
And get to that, answer that in a second. Mike is right. He went all over Galatia. Just because it's not mentioned that he went to Colorado Springs in northern Galatia doesn't mean he didn't go there. Doesn't mean he established a church there. So he went all over Galatia. And the answer to the question is, why is that an issue? A lot of that hinges on when scholars want to date the book. Do they want to date it early, or do they want to date it later? Date it early, it's got to be the southern one. Date it later, it's got to be the northern, because Paul needed time to get up there. And again, what difference does that make? None at all. I saw it. Janelle, did you have a hand up?
I did.
Okay.
He's preaching the same message wherever he is.
Right.
So what difference does it make?
Sure, absolutely. Flo?
Well, when you look at Paul's missionary journeys, he was all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't think he made a distinction necessarily when we talk about the north or the south. I think he was teaching and creating churches and then going back and encouraging them, strengthening them, and also sometimes being pretty harsh on them, like the Galatians. In the Galatians, they were walking away from God. He tells them that in verse 6. And then in 7, he says, you listen to all these stories about Antichrist, and people were teaching the opposite. So he was really focused on them only because that church, the churches in Galatia were falling away.
Yeah.
And he was always doing that. And I don't think Paul made a distinction where he went.
No, I don't think he did either. And I think when we think about, yes, these 4 cities are mentioned because he went there, and we know there were churches there. Was he all over Galatia? Sure, could have been. We don't know. But the point that was made earlier is whatever message he preached to Iconium, there's a little town at the top of that A up there, he'd have preached the same gospel to that little town as well. And so the issue is not that big a deal. I would say that probably another thing, we'll get to the slide in a minute, is we know there was a larger Jewish population in the southern part of Galatia than in the north. And that, based on the issues of the Judaizing teachers, might play into which one of those theories we would promote rather than not. Glenn?
I don't remember the verse, but the people that lived up on the southern side of the Black Sea, the Black Sea, the Black Sea, they were spoken of not very well. They weren't thought very highly of.
Yeah.
So that may be a part of it.
It could be a part of it. Again, we said that the original settlers of Galatia were warriors and guns for hire, literally. So they're a rough bunch of people to begin with. Now, whether that changed as they kind of became farmers and ranchers and herders, maybe so, but maybe they were still kind of what we call, in a tongue-in-cheek manner, the salt of the earth kind of people. So, again, I bring that up only because if you read a commentary, it's going to be in there, and they're going to spend 3 or 4 pages dealing with that. And if you wanted to skip over that, I would encourage you to do that and not worry about it. But I wanted to bring it up just so you're aware of the issue. When was it written? Well, take your pick. George Finley says AD 46. The latest is David Lipscomb, one of our brothers, AD 57 to 58. William Ramsey said it was in May of AD 53. Now, how he knows that, I have no idea. But that's what he says. It was May of AD 53. Linsky says April of AD 53. And again, we don't get too bogged down in the dates of the book. some, and in fact many scholars who take the earlier view, maybe not quite as early as AD 46, say Galatians was Paul's very first letter that he wrote. Whether it was or not, we don't know. We can't discern that. But if it is, then the natural thought process of that is Paul wrote his first letter dealing with Judaizing teachers trying to change the nature of the church. So that issue was a big issue early on in the first century. People changing over from Judaism to Christianity. And that would mesh with the issues that they were having back in Jerusalem and in the area of Palestine and in those churches that had a high Jewish population, because they were still trying to hang on to that Judaism. And that would make sense that he would write that early on to say, we got to stop this before it becomes an issue within the church. Dave? I thought you had your hand up now. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions right now? All right. The purpose of the book. Why did he write? Well, we've already alluded to that. The occasion and purpose of the letter seemed to primarily be the effort of Paul to defend himself and his apostleship after the rise of opposition by Judaizing teachers. At the same time, this afforded Paul the opportunity to defend the gospel and its basic nature as against the law and its basic nature. That's J.D. Thomas out of his particular commentary. And here's what we said earlier. Antiochus III, from 222 to 187 BC, resettled 2,000 Jewish families in the southern area of Galatia. Okay, so you've got 2,000 Jewish families in 222 to 187. Josephus tells us that in his Antiquities work. Assuming the early date of AD 46 for the writing of the book, that means 233 years have passed since those Jewish settlers were put into that area. And what happens to families in 233 years? They grow. They get bigger. And so that population would likely have grown and been a significant part of the population at that point in time. And so we've had 233 years for that Jewish population to become a major part of the culture of the area, which would explain why there was such strong pushback to what Paul was preaching, because the gospel was, in a sense, diametrically opposed to the old law. And so you have that conflict, that butting of heads between those two ideas, between those two covenants. And with the high Jewish population there, that makes sense that Paul would have to write such a particular idea. All right. Outline of the book. Guy Oberson Jr., as you know, preached at Durango for years and years. He hosted the Workshop in the Word, which Grady and I would go to every year in April up in the mountains and spend a week in exegetical study of the Bible. And one year, I forget what year it was, we did the Book of Galatians. And he did an expanded outline of that book, which we're not going to go through because it's 4 pages long. But I say that if you'd like to have a copy of that outline, I'd be happy to email you one or make you a copy of that if you'd like to have it. Because he goes through and in 4 pages kind of really gets down and dirty in analyzing the content of the book and what's going on. And I've always liked outlines because they help you kind of see the structure of the book. Rather than just reading it as a story, as a narrative, you break those down into its individual points, and sometimes you can see, aha, he meant that because he said this up here, or he meant that because he said that up there. And so that's an important part of the idea. So if you would like a copy of that particular outline, I'll be happy to provide that for you. And you can use that in your own study. Again, like I said, I'll print it or I'll email it to you if you'd rather have it in an electronic form. It's a Word document, so you can then use it and edit it, whatever you want to do. Here's a more general outline of the book, and this is out of the New Open Study Bible Study Edition, which is my favorite study Bible, the one I've got right in front of my keyboard that I use every day. And basically, it puts it in 3 categories. And what do you notice is the common theme of all that? Grace. The gospel of grace defended, the gospel of grace explained, and the gospel of grace applied. And so Paul is going to talk about Old Testament law, New Testament law, but his focus is going to be on grace. Why? Why is that so important?
Kind of the opposite of the law.
Okay. It's the opposite of the law in a sense. It's the Old Testament law, well, we'll talk about this in a minute. There was grace in the Old Testament. We'll think about that in just a minute. But the character of the New Testament law was, you don't get there by being born into it. You don't get there by being necessarily converted into it, although that's part of the process. The old law was for Israel alone, and those who converted to Israel. The gospel is for everyone. And the grace part of that is God made it available. When we were without strength, in due time, Christ died for the righteous. Right? That's what Paul says in Romans, isn't it? No, the ungodly. And so, grace is a gift. It's a free gift that we accept. Now, that's not to say we don't have to do anything to accept that gift. We understand that. There's obedience and all of that. But what we do in response to grace is in no way earning that grace, because we can't earn that grace. It's impossible. But we can freely take it and are forgiven of sins that otherwise we would carry with us to our grave. And that's what Paul is trying to say. And he's trying to point out that if you go back to that old law and attempt to be justified under that old law, you miss grace. You missed it. And you don't want to miss that, because that's the only thing that gets you to heaven. Glenn?
John 1:17, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Christ. Right,
grace and truth through Jesus Christ, absolutely. So, yeah, Elwin.
Well, the other thing that's really important to mention here, too, is that God's with him on every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
God had already told him, or the Lord already told him, what his situation was going to be, what he was going to have to face, because we know he was beaten, stoned, and a whole bunch of things happened to him. But one thing that I believe that can help us is that if God says he's with us, he's not joking. He is with us.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, Paul's strength, Paul's ability to put up with all of this garbage that was happening to the church and to him, he trusted God.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's, again, grace is going to be the key topic of the book of Galatians. Grace is a key topic in the book of Romans. Well, grace is a key topic in every book in the New Testament, because it's that important. And so we've got to understand that and keep that in mind and realize that it's not because Kevin deserved it, but because God loved me enough to do it in spite of the fact I didn't deserve it. And that's what grace is all about. Dave?
Well, I just reading here from William Barclay that the word grace, the Greek word, was not invented for the purpose of the Bible. It also means beauty and charm.
Yeah.
So there's another meaning there that is not religious, but it still has. It would still get people's attention.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. It has a secular meaning, and then as it's pulled into the New Testament, it takes on a very spiritual meaning, a very deep spiritual meaning about our relationship with God. As we said, there is grace in the Old Testament. Is grace the only topic in the New Testament? The word grace appears 18 times in the Old Testament. And the Hebrew word for grace is a mirror image of the Greek word for grace. And so it has that secular meaning, but it can have that spiritual meaning as well in the Old Testament. These are the verses where it appears, Genesis 6:8. We're not going to look at all of those. We'll look at a couple of those just because to kind of give us a context of that. Genesis 6 and verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. What was the world like in Noah's day? Bad. There's not a word that could probably express how awful it was during that day. But Noah found grace. And you say, well, how did he do that? Well, he was faithful. He was trying to do right. He'd been noticed by God. But you think about Sodom and Gomorrah. They couldn't find anybody faithful there, so they destroyed the whole town. Could that have happened in the days of the flood? Could God have destroyed everyone, Noah included? Yeah, he could have, without a doubt. Flo?
Well, thank goodness for grace.
Yes.
Go back to the Israelites in the Old Testament, and what were they doing? Be with God, walk away from him. Now we're here in 46, 50 AD, and Paul dealing with the same thing. People are falling away, moving away from God. And I think that's one reason that God put Paul where he is.
Yeah.
Because the church is going to need that, just like we need it today.
Sure, absolutely. And had God not been graceful and extended grace to Israel, they would not have lasted very long. That's simple. That's the simple truth of their relationship. Exodus 33:13. Now therefore I pray, if I found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. Again, that's the word grace as it's used there in Exodus 33. So they understood it in a sense. Couldn't understand it in the complete sense through Jesus Christ, but they understood the idea of grace. Ezra 9 and verse 8. And now for a little while, grace has been shown from the Lord our God to leave us a remnant to escape and to give us a peg in his holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and give us a message of revival in our bondage. Of course, this during the Babylonian captivity, the rebuilding of the temple after that, and you know that history and that story. Babylonian captivity could have been like the Assyrian captivity, and Israel was no more. But with the grace of God, it was only 70 years. They came back and were able to restore the worship of God in Israel. Proverbs 3 and verse 34, surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble. And so there was grace in the Old Testament. And this one's interesting. Zechariah 12 and verse 1. I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look to me whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for his firstborn. Is that a prophecy? About what? Jesus, isn't it? About the coming of Jesus. I will pour on the house of David the spirit of grace. And so grace, as we understand it in the New Testament, can't be understood without the connection to Jesus. That's the key, and that's what makes it special. That's what makes it unique, and that's what makes it wonderful for us to contemplate. We understand that we're saved through grace, and we ought to be thankful for that, because without that, we would have no hope. Paul's summative statement about himself, and maybe about us as well. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And isn't that a wonderful statement? It's not me, it's Christ. Christ lives in me. And a key verse to the book, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. And that, in essence, sums up everything that's going to be in the book of Galatians. If righteousness comes from the law, then Jesus' death was meaningless for us. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free. Do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And again, talking about that old law, don't go back to it. Don't be bound by it again, because it cannot save you. You can pour out all the blood of all the bulls and all the goats, and what do you got to do? Next year, you got to do it all over again. But with Jesus, there was that once-for-all sacrifice, so that we're no longer in bondage. We are free. And living in this country, we know what freedom is like, and we understand and appreciate what freedom is all about. Galatians helps us to answer one question. What makes one a Christian? And we're out of time, so we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week. Appreciate your participation.